Today I'm going to be talking about ethical choices. Some of them are when we say yes, and some of them are when we say no. And I'll also be talking about the no's that are in yeses and the yeses that are in no's. So our theme for March is commitment. Saying yes and saying no are how we keep our commitments. An ethical society is a community of people committed to renewing our world and the world of our children, and also to having a place to learn and practice ethical living. Learning to say yes and learning to say no are, you might say, among our most essential spiritual practices. Some of us are better at one of those than the other. Lucille Ball is credited with saying, "If you want something done, ask a busy person to do it. The more things you do, the more you can do." There are some people who say yes all the time and seem to make that work. In ethical societies, we tend to be people who have also learned to say no, especially to authority. We are not big here on blind obedience, in fact, to any obedience. You might say many of us have an authority allergy. But saying no all the time doesn't work well either. Too much no in our lives, and we risk having no fun, having no adventures, taking no risks, and not growing or developing beyond where we are today. Saying yes all the time doesn't work well. In making busier people busier, it can sometimes result in burnout. Jeff Schieneberger, who runs a nonprofit in Atlanta that helps other nonprofits get started, pointed out another problem when we say yes all the time. He wrote, "When I claim more than what I can handle, I limit the opportunities for another person in my community." Saying yes and saying no is tied closely to the sense of busyness that's a central fact of so many of our lives. Lucille Ball referred to it: ask a busy person to do something if you want it done. But too much busyness, and we face real limits of time and energy. There are 24 hours in a day, 1,440 minutes. No matter what we do, that is our limit. We can become more efficient. We can say no to time wasters and substitute more important activities, but we can't really stretch out the day or the week or the year. During this pandemic, the stress between work and family life has become even more than it was, especially for parents of young children. Everyone, I think, has had to say yes and no where we didn't want to do it. Before the pandemic, many of us worked long hours, commuted, had lots of volunteer activities, and there was usually even more that we wished we could do or said we would do. At the same time, let's face it, we've wasted a lot of time. Rush hour is one of those stresses that has changed for most during the pandemic. In New York City, rush hour used to last 3 hours at least every morning, 7 to 10, and 3 hours every evening, 4 to 7. Those are the official hours of rush hour. And, that's half the time between 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. Plus, there's another rush hour in New York City on Thursdays and Fridays from 10 p.m. to midnight for people going into and out of Manhattan for parties, plays, events. Yes, that has been reduced for now. Traffic midweek in the Bronx is at about three-quarter the pre-pandemic level. Manhattan traffic is less than half what it used to be. But some experts predict it could become even higher when schools and workplaces reopen, if, as expected, people who can will avoid the crowds of public transportation in favor of taking individual cars. And let's face it, too, lower traffic has had some real downsides. In this pandemic year, there's been more fast driving, and traffic deaths have actually been higher than normal. I spent many of my younger years in corporate America commuting to work. For one job, I had to leave the house at 6:30 a.m. in order to get to work in 45 minutes. If I left any later than 6:30 a.m., it would take more than an hour to get there. And that was traveling against the main flow of traffic towards the city. Evenings were even worse. There was no good time when I could make the trip home in only an hour. I tried music radio and talk radio. Both made me more frazzled by the time I got to work or to home. I tried silence, and that made me almost as frazzled as talk radio did because I'd spend the time thinking of all sorts of good ideas. And then as soon as I got out of the car, I'd forget them. Carrying a voice recorder helped, but eventually I learned that the long car rides were a good time to attend to my own learning. And I began to listen to books on tape. And yes, they were on tape then. I am someone who loves to read. My family, then it was two young sons at home, plus work and travel time and volunteer time, meant that I had very little time in those days to read. So using that rush hour time that way was a great way to say yes to my own needs. Being too busy to do what you really love to do or need to do is a kind of hell. We don't want to say no to those activities that we know will develop our better selves. We need to interact with others in order to develop our truly best selves. So it's even more difficult to do it when we're over busy. We need to have time for ourselves and time with others. Some of us find fulfillment in our relationships at work or with our families or in our volunteer work. That too has shifted during this pandemic time and will shift again. It's a good time as we begin to think about the end of the real shutdown time to rethink the balance in our lives as that new shift begins. The shift in this culture has especially affected women. First, over a longer period of time, women taking up paid employment outside the home in larger numbers began in the 1960s, really, um, with the workday then stretching to more and more hours each week. Then the shift to having to do both work and family care during this pandemic time. When we look at employment numbers, it becomes starkly clear the effect on women. The rise in COVID-19 cases in the winter meant 140,000 people in December left the workplace. 140,000. But women lost 156,000 jobs while men gained 16,000 during December. Some of that is due to the disproportionate number of Black and Latina women working in retail, restaurants, hospitality, and other service sectors. Some has been the disproportionate burden of childcare and remote learning that has fallen on mothers. And then there's the effect long term of busyness on religious life or on taking care of your ethical life. There's a fair amount of evidence, for instance, showing that church attendance has been dropping for decades, even before closures of in person services during the pandemic. Some of that is due to loss of faith, and some of it is just even people with faith who don't go anymore. If we go by what people tell pollsters, attendance had been going up. And again, that's from before the pandemic. But when researchers looked at specific towns and counted attendance at actual religious institutions, it actually didn't match what people tell the pollsters. People want to be the kind of people who say yes to these commitments, but they often aren't able to live up to their own standards, even if they're telling pollsters they are. And that's true of ethical societies and even more true all around during Zoom time. We often say yes with words and say no with actions. As my mother said regularly, and maybe yours did too, actions speak louder than words. We have a culture today in which saying yes is much more common than actually doing yes. People say yes with their actions to long work hours. long childcare and remote learning hours, or they say yes to being stuck in traffic delays or contorting their schedules to avoid traffic. We do many things we would like to do less of, but we still say yes to them. And in doing so, we are often saying no to other important actions, including self care. Every yes we say is a no to something else. Pre pandemic, an article some years ago in the New York Times Magazine looked at parents who were working longer and longer hours. And in many interviews, these researchers discovered that for a lot of parents, the real truth was that staying late at work was easier than figuring out how to be a better parent. Many admitted, if they talked long enough to the interviewer, that they were in fact not trying to keep their hours manageable because the prospect of their lives at home was more depressing than the prospect of long hours at work. It wasn't that they were enjoying working those long hours. It was that they dreaded working long hours less than they dreaded family time. What did that mean then when those parents were thrown into working from home and dealing with more childcare and education supervision? What does it mean in particular for people's ability to be part of communities like this ethical society or the religious community of their choice? This pandemic time has meant that many parents of young children are saying no to that, no matter how important it was to them or their children. I don't have young children or any children at home right now, but I have had my time of life of shifting priorities. There was a year in my life when one of my sons was having a lot of trouble learning to read. I needed to spend time with him to help him get through that learning successfully. I also had a job at the time that often required more than 40 hours in the week, plus that awful commute that I described earlier. So, for a period of time, I gave up all outside commitments, dropping out of the community to which we had belonged, stopping the political and social justice involvement that had been an important part of my life, and generally constricting myself to just work and family. It was not a successful and pleasant year for me. I found myself dreading each day as I got up. And I didn't feel really that I had any more time than I'd had before. For the first time in my life, I suspected that I had slipped into some level of depression. And as soon as I realized that, I realized I'd gone wrong in how I had made the changes to my life. What I actually needed was not to give up all my outside involvements because they helped me to be the full person I really was and wanted to become. Instead, I needed to manage them better. And I also needed to manage my work and family time better. It was not helpful to have more time to work with my son if I felt depressed and unenergetic all the time. So instead, I found ways to enjoy the time with my son as I helped him learn. For instance, I started taking him to more movies and plays so it could help him enjoy the words that were written by others while he was still struggling with the actual reading skills. And I returned to some of my volunteer activities. I brought him with me more often than I had before, letting him see more of what an active, fulfilled adult life looked like. And I saw him listening, observing, and learning. And finally, near the end of the year, he suddenly got reading. That moment actually reminded me a lot of the Helen Keller story, where the young Helen suddenly gets the connection between the letters spelled into her hand and the ideas and objects that are being spelled out. Well, that was a difficult year for me. I personally was one of those rare kids who was never taught to read. I figured out reading myself because I was read to a lot. Thus, I had no models for what it was like to be taught to read. My learning to read happened early enough, at the latest by the time I was 4, that I have no memory of any moment when I suddenly got it, though there must have been such a moment. I do remember months and months of trying to convince adults that I could read. Oh, no, you're not reading. You've just memorized all the words, they would say. Well, we got through that year. I rebalanced my life the best I could for my own sake as well as my family's. I can't say that I've always found just the right balance. It's always a struggle to figure out what to say yes to and what to say no to. But going through that struggle, I believe that's one of the most important ways we also teach our children how to balance their lives. Whether to say yes or no, it's not so simple as saying, say more no or say more yes. It's an art more than a science. It's less like filling up an old fashioned dance card and more like actually dancing. And no and yes are more closely related than we usually think. In order to say no to the right things, we also need to know what we're trying to say yes to. Most Americans find it very difficult to say no to taking more work time. Long ago, in a galaxy far away, I was in charge of training entry level computer programmers in a large corporation. In each new group of trainees, some of the trainees would evolve habits of working later and later to get their test programs done. I tried to watch for this. When I saw it happening with someone with any consistency, not just a one time push in a special situation, I would intervene. I would tell them to take a day off. That sounded totally counterintuitive. And usually the person argued with me. They didn't want to take a time off. They feared that they would get even more behind. And that's when I moved into authority mode and told them it was a requirement. And every single time I had to do this, the person returned to work the following day after their day off and quickly completed the task they had been stuck on for days. Why did it work that way? At least with computer programming, I believe, when a problem is resisting a solution, more hard work and more hard thinking isn't actually going to make the solution appear. Rest and a break usually help a lot more. Of course, that can be overdone too. I never had to deal with trainees who took too many days off, but I've seen it in my life. Even people who take the day off from work while appearing to stay at work. Easier to do in recent years when you can hop on Facebook or on your phone or desktop computer. In other places in life, people can say no without appearing to say no. Avoiding and withdrawing, seeming to cooperate, but really just going along to get along, are all ways one can appear to say yes, especially when that appears to be the only safe course. But we're actually saying no. We're not happy people when we do that. I had a very demanding boss for about 5 years back in my corporate work life. He believed that if anyone was successful on the job, he could not let them rest. He had to keep ramping up the demands. It was actually a management theory he had. He also obviously had no idea of the time it took to maintain success in existing projects. He was full of ideas for new things to take on. And he didn't believe that he should take no for an answer. So those of us who worked for him learned we had to say yes, and then only actually work on those things that he suggested more than 3 or 4 times. He forgot, we learned, at least 90% of what he told you to do. And so if you could figure out which 10% he really wanted you to do and focus on that, and you did that 10% well, he saw you as successful. And that 10% of the projects he asked you to do was probably the most of all that he asked you to do that any energetic, enthusiastic person could possibly ever get to. It was not a good work experience. Learning to ignore even good ideas and learning to pretend to say yes and then wait to see if it was a serious request is to diminish yourself. Yet, as I watched a few people who worked for him try to meet all his demands, I realized that it was even worse to imagine that saying yes really to everything he wanted was possible or healthy. Ironically, the company that we worked for was headed 2 levels up from my boss by a man who is frequently quoted as saying this: have the courage to say no, have the courage to face the truth, do the right thing because it is right. These are the magic keys to living your life with integrity. Finding the right yes and the right no, that is the dance. Sometimes it's finding the right yes and the right no to say to our kids. And that can be the best way to help them learn for the future about their own boundaries. The same is true with marriage. Way back in the 1840s, a few brave couples amended their marriage ceremonies. It was one of the first feminist acts of the young Elizabeth Cady to say no to including the promise to obey when she married Henry Stanton. Saying no to the one sided vow to obey was very important to women in moving towards more equality in marriage. When I'm working with a couple planning their wedding, I give to them a booklet that includes many readings. One of them I include is from the Franklin's Tale by Chaucer, written more than 600 years ago. A character in that story says this about marriage: for there is one thing I can safely say, that those bound by love must obey each other if they are to keep company long. Yes, in marriage, saying yes to each other is often as important as saying no. And figuring out which are which is the dance. Most of us have to work hard to learn the art and skill of knowing which is which. No relationship can survive without saying yes. And no marriage can survive in which the couple does not in some sense obey each other. Children cannot thrive if we don't say yes to their creativity and needs sometimes. No community can survive without saying yes to our own growth by being part of the community, including yes to aiding the growth of others. So earlier, I suggested you name 3 commitments you have to yourself. Those could be a commitment to read more books this year, a commitment to spending more fun time with your kids, a commitment to being more active, working to end some injustice or make some large change in the world. I suggest you continue that process, maybe identifying 3 commitments you already have and want to keep, and 2 more that you're willing to make. And then write them down on 3x5 cards. If we were in person, I would be handing out blank cards right now for you. And then put those cards where you can see them every day and let them guide your yeses and your nos. The purpose of this is to be intentional, especially as life shifts and changes over the next year um, come in ways that we cannot now predict. What are my commitments I want to maintain even through that change? How can I say the right yes in different aspects of my life? How do I know what no's I need to say so that I can say yes to what's really important? And when we say no, we need to think about what saying that no means we're saying yes to. So I'm going to close with 2 quotes that I think summarize this well with succinct clarity. This is from author Stephanie Lehart. Let today mark a new beginning for you. Give yourself permission to say no without feeling guilty, mean, or selfish. Anybody who gets upset and or expects you to say yes all of the time clearly doesn't have your best interests at heart. Always remember you have a right to say no without having to explain yourself. Be at peace with your decisions. And this from a very different author, Wallace Stevens. After the final no, there comes a yes. And on that yes, the future world depends. We'll say goodbye now to those joining us on video. Come join us another Sunday, usually at 11 a.m. Find out more about us at rysec.org.